Andrew.
Oh, well, hello. Which way around my
That's it.
phone should be? You want it
Just
vertical?
That's it. That's it.
And can you
How
see
are
enough
you?
of me? Or I've got my phone on a
Maybe
box, so it's a bit high.
a little down a bit. Just angle it in a little bit.
Yeah, just hang on.
Nice wallpaper. We're nearly there. Oh, that's right there.
Some weather. Cool.
Brilliant. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm absolutely. No, sort of interested to see how this goes.
Good, excellent. I'm just going to send a couple of little invites out. We can invite people. Let's see. We can just send it to a few people. So I'm just going to let them know. Right, there. Just one or two more. Brilliant. Okay. And I'm also just going to shut the door because I don't want any noise from outside. Brilliant. I will thank you for joining us today. We haven't got anyone with us yet, but we will have soon. Have you managed to see any of the other sessions in the series at all?
To be honest, I haven't, Melissa. I'm sorry. They all look amazing.
Don't worry.
Fascinating
Don't worry
people.
at all. They are. I'm sure many of the names will be familiar to you because it's a fairly small sort of community, isn't it? In effect, there are a lot of names that come up again.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Are you in Bath today?
Yes, I am. I'm at home today, just coping with all the chain of emails and things. Interesting projects.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I thought what we'll do is I don't really go too much into our bio, but bearing in mind that some people will know you, some people won't. I thought maybe we'd sort of kick off with a little bit about how you got to to where you are, and kind of to frame it, and then I have a number of questions lined up. Also, anyone that is watching can actually send a question to us if they put it in the comments section. So I can see, for example, we've got Audrey with us. If Audrey has any questions, then she can write them in the comments, because I'm sure with your work there will be questions. We are recording today, and that is because with the time zones and everything, it just means that people that can't join us live can then catch up with it later. So I thought I'd kick off really. Andrew, you have been working with Creative Ecologies for a few decades now, haven't you? I mean, you started Grant Associates in 1997, and so I wondered, how did you get involved with it? How did you become a landscape architect, and how did it all start?
Okay, well that takes me back a bit. I studied landscape architecture in Edinburgh. It was at the Edinburgh College of Art and Heriot-Waite University. This is way back in the late 70s and early 80s. And what was interesting with that particular course was that it was set up by David Skinner, who's sadly no longer with us, but he was a student of Ian McHarg. I don't know if you've come across Ian McHarg, yes. But he basically wrote that amazing book, Design with Nature. Yeah. And the whole sort of philosophy about ecosystems and how everything is related, and it's, you really look at the big structure of the world and then bring it into focus as you think about your projects, was really the start, I think, for me to get into thinking of in terms of an ecological process for landscape design. It's not just about what it looks like or the aesthetics or the sensory experience. It has to work harder. So, once I graduated, I got different experience in different parts of the world. I went to Qatar quite quickly after graduating. I lived in Qatar for 3 years, which was a really interesting cultural experience, because you got to understand that lots of the things you learned don't actually necessarily work in a different environment, in a different culture. And so you have to really recognize those sort of dynamics really carefully. And then when I came back to the UK, I worked on various sort of interesting projects for Nicholas Bates & Associates in Bath. Often the frontiers of environmental assessment, actually, which was emerging at that time. And then I decided I just wanted to get back into more design project. So I set up my own company, and here we are 25 years later, effectively just still going and enjoying life, and hopefully creating some nice places and some nice ideas.
And yeah, I mean, I quoted McHarg's book because I mean, Ed Wall at Greenwich, he was one of the sort of characters advising me on books and so forth, and so that was, I think that was one of the books he recommended. Obviously, you know, we had a lot of the visions, a lot of the ideas about working with nature were coming through at that time, but in practice, it was quite a different world back in the 90s. What kind of changes have you seen within and of your work over that time, and when working with the built environment community, be it, you know, working with planners or with broader teams, working with architectural teams, how have things moved on from the 90s?
Well, in some respects, mainstream, not that much, not as much as you'd really like. I mean, I think that's one of the sad things, is that all the interesting architects and landscape architects, ecologists and artists and designers who are engaged with ecological thinking, biological processes, are a tiny minority of the broad professions.
Yeah.
And still we're sort of still, it's all about pioneering still. And even though the principles of how you can do these things better have been known, as you say, for decades, and we can definitely, you know how to do it, it's very hard to sort of get things really moving. Saying that, I think over the last 2-3 years, I can sense that there is something changing, certainly in the UK, that the sort of the emphasis on biodiversity net gain, the emphasis on net zero, lots of councils, the government saying net zero, emergency. So it's sort of, it's triggered a sort of a slightly different mindset, I think, in terms of how things have got to move forward. I think it's still painful. I think a lot of these people who've made these statements are finding it very hard to know, okay, well, how do we do it? But I think there's definitely a shift. I mean, we found from our perspective as landscape architects working internationally that we're getting involved in more interesting, bigger scale projects where the client, often governments, are saying, we want to create a new vision for how we create a sort of more landscape, more biodiverse, more publicly engaging, pedestrian friendly, people friendly environment. And you know, for us, that's fantastic. And hopefully that continues. Yeah.
And that's, you know, I mean, that is positive to hear, because I think, you know, often, certainly as visionaries, those within the broad domain of architecture, you know, by which I'm speaking to architecture in its you know, biggest sense, come up with great ideas, but it really is the policymakers, it is the governments, it is the funding mechanisms that really make this happen. So the fact that you've seen that shift is really positive, and you know, it's good to hear that we have at least some progress. I think actually I've noticed a parallel between the what's happening in landscape architecture and in architecture and actually fashion, in that when you look to the early 90s, my earliest interrogations into all things sort of bio and what became known as circular design were looking at materials, looking at the fact that fashion had massive waste, and you know, creating a collection that was designed to literally be, you know, composted at the end of its life. And, you know, within that construct, the whole sort of value of what fashion is changes. But of course, you know, I wasn't alone. There was Hussein Chalayan's Central St. Martin's graduation show back in 1993. He buried the clothes, and he was looking at how the, you know, by that process, the material properties changed. And so his collection had a very organic feel. I mean, aesthetically, the sort of collection I envisaged was very close to his. And one thing that in some ways surprises me is when I look to sort of the biomaterials application to fashion today, it is very, very similar in that it can feel like, you know, certainly conceptually things have not moved that much. But the difference is that back then, back in the 90s, it didn't seem at all feasible that you could so much as think about really doing more than 1 or 2 collections that were working with biomaterials, let alone actually creating brands, let alone actually building whole business models, because, you know, many people just weren't interested, and there there was no agenda by government, and now that does seem to be changing. So it feels like across this general space there is a movement, and it's a positive one. So
no, I think you're right. I mean, I was reflecting on this the other day with my co-directors, because when we started, I mean, we set ourselves up where we want to explore sustainable development, environmental design, ecological systems, and we had great projects. We had the Earth Centre up in Doncaster, which failed as a sort of visitor attraction, but it allowed us as a practice, a young practice, to really explore loads of issues to do with sustainable landscape architecture, water systems, waste management, recycling materials, creating sort of little forest gardens, using natural systems to clean water. We had it all there, which was brilliant. And then we did some other sort of interesting projects like the Wessex Water Operations Centre here in Bath, which was an exemplary office development at the time. But when we tried to sort of engage with the commercial world, more urban projects, the clients said, well, you don't do urban, you do rural.
yeah.
And what's interesting now is that all the sort of skills and things that we talk about, sustainable urban drainage systems, ecological systems, biodiversity, is exactly what the developers and the clients and local authorities are looking for. So now we're winning work in big cities where the skills that we've learned over 25 years are absolutely appropriate now, apparently.
And I think what's really interesting about your work, I mean, I would rank yours as being one of the most creative landscape architectural practices in the world, because when you think about projects, you don't just think about them in terms of the box ticking. This isn't simply about environmental remediation. This is, you mentioned earlier, about culture, and about the fact that when you work in different parts of the world, you have to adapt your methodologies, your vision, to meet with the cultures of the peoples of that place. And that, I think, is incredibly important. And as a practice, I've noticed you get involved in projects that are visionary and that are really pushing the parameters that a lot of practices don't get involved in. And it does feel to me that for a long time that wasn't necessarily something that necessarily won you work, but now you're saying it is shifting, and the things that the ideology of your business, effectively your mission, is resonating with where at least some developers are now arriving at. And and I'm thinking one of the development firms, I'll invite him now, James Scott of Urban and Civic, which is, I'm sure you've probably come across Urban and Civic. I know certainly when they're doing developments, they think very deeply, not just about the ecology aspect of it, but they also think about the matter that these things have to be culturally appropriate, not just for weeks or for months, but for decades, because their developments are going to be sitting there hopefully at the end of the century and beyond. And it certainly, I think the things that you integrate, you've integrated for a very, very long time in your business, I see as being very much in sync with where they're at, and where if you look at their sort of their mission statement and their their business model, this is sort of come together. But it's almost like sort of a convergence. We're at that point of almost a singularity of the creative ecology, the thinking, and now commercial is coming in and realizing that this isn't just about this isn't just about sort of a nice idea that it has no value. This is imperative to the business model.
Absolutely. No, that is exactly right. I mean, we do a lot of work with Urban Splash, who are a similar sort of developer who, they want to create a new modern product, and the modular housing system that they're developing is very much about how do we minimize resources, how do we create the most energy efficient buildings, how do we create beautiful environments for people to live in. But because they are modular environments, the architecture with a few typologies, what makes it different is how they sit in the landscape. How do we create a sort of landscape framework for those? How do we bring nature to the front door, and all those sort of themes that become part of a brand as well as a sort of an environment that is beautiful to live in and sustainable. And I think that's where certainly some key developers are heading. They recognise the value of that.
And and I was thinking another thing. I mean, in many ways, working with ecologies can be more complex than working with building materials, or at least, I mean, not if we're talking about living materials and biomaterials and so forth, but if you're working with creatures as opposed to what most buildings are made of, which is mineral elements, they're made of sand, they're made of glass and so forth. You are dealing with something that is cyclical in its nature and that is highly adaptive, and that even in this past sort of quarter century has seen many adaptations to the climate, to the changing humidity levels, to the fact that the parameters of the environment today are already very different. When as a team you're looking to the projects that you create, to how these will evolve over time, what's your process in that? I mean, what sort of data and information do you think about when you're doing, for example, choosing the plant schema, choosing what's going to go where, looking at how you may need to change it over time? What's the sort of the process there?
Well, I mean, the fact is that for most big projects, big urban projects, you need to assemble a team of people who can give you the right sort of guidance. And we're working on a master planning project at the moment in a European context, where we're probably leading a team of about 10 sub-consultants, of which an ecologist is a fundamental part of that. But also somebody who is really looking at microclimates and the sort of climatic shifts. We're just looking at a place where just really looking strategically at the potential climate change and how it changes the environment from something like Genoa to Naples. It could, that the shift of temperatures over the next 50 years could be that significant.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, and that then informs everything else you do with that. And often with the ecologist, you go back to, well, what has been the resilient sort of habitats and the systems that have been here for centuries, as a starting point, and to what extent they will actually still be sustainable within this next cycle of change. But yeah, I mean, it's really, really important. I mean, hydrology, soils, ecology, climate are just, they're the fundamental pieces of the jigsaw that you need before you can even start to think about what is the sort of vegetative environment going to be? What's the, what do we need to do in terms of creating comfort and shade and microclimate aspects?
So you've already, in effect, you're factoring in, what if we were to use the ecological term, would be environmental regime shifts. You're already thinking about that, you're integrating that, looking at long timelines, working transdisciplinary, and that you're bringing teams of expertise, you're bespoke hand picking that to the projects, obviously as befits, among other things, the regions and their regional native and potentially invasive and migratory ecologies.
Yeah, and it's a sort of a whole new world of professional management in a way, because suddenly you've gone from being somebody who draws landscapes to being a project manager, and there's a whole different skill set that suddenly comes with all of the challenges that we're faced with.
And I'm really, I mean, obviously you've obviously expanded from Bath, the spiritual home of Grant Associates. You now have the office in Singapore, 1 foot in Asia, 1 foot in Europe. How do you find that the cultures of these two places are different? And also, how do you find, to take those two territories, to take Britain and Singapore as examples, how do you find that impacts on the decisions that you're making in terms of the proposals that you make?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously we got into the Singapore world of design and landscapes and urban planning through Gardens by the Bay way back in, it was 2006 we started that project as a competition. But what was very clear from the outset was that Singapore, as soon as you get to know Singapore in terms of how it's governed, what their processes are for creating clarity in terms of what they need to do as a country. It was really interesting to sort of see how that is so lacking, or was so lacking here in the UK, in terms of, you know, the urban greening factor approach, you know, making sure that development sites have to deliver green space, ecological benefits on their development plot. They've been doing it in Singapore for decades, really, and making it more sophisticated. And the whole language of how they talk about the place. It's not Singapore as this big sort of hard industrial or commercial building environment. It's a city in a garden. And now they're talking about it as a city in nature. And through that sort of big headline, which comes from, you know, the Prime Minister and the whole cabinet, government cabinet down, it sort of sets the agenda for every single piece of legislation and how the different departments need to respond to that. And I think I'd love to see more of that sort of top-down big vision statement happening in the UK. In Paris, clearly, they've been doing that, you know, the big vision for Paris through the mayor, Hidalgo. But in Europe, it's sort of few and far between. But it's that sort of transformational messaging and agenda that, as you were saying earlier, has to come in a way from government that's needed to really sort of start to create some pace and momentum for this.
So when you're,
so
you know, sorry, go on.
No, so you basically have to take every opportunity you can in terms of engaging with government organizations and things. So from me personally, the two things I've done, one is, well, it wasn't my choice. I applied to join the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group and was taken on board of that, which is basically allowed us as a small team to create a set of design principles for all national infrastructure in the UK, of which climate and ecology are fundamentally embedded in some of those principles. And then locally here in Bath, I mean, we have the Bathscape Landscape Partnership, which is this wonderful assembly of organisations who have an interest in the landscape setting of the city. And I've become the chair of that, and it's really wonderful to be able to see how these organisations, which includes people like the National Trust, the Woodland Trust, the local Bath Preservation Trust, lots of trusts, and all the universities and the council, all sort of working together to try and find, you know, what are the things we need to do to make the local landscape resilient? How do we sustain this amazing World Heritage Site context that we've got? So we all have to go out there. We have to be agents of change, really, with the people that we think can make those decisions and policies.
I saw Audrey posted a question earlier. She asked, with respect to the sort of the shift in funding of these projects,
yeah.
is your impression that this is actually, if you like, migrating towards the sort of fundamental principles of creative ecology, or do you feel that this is following trends? Do you feel it's a deep shift, or do you feel it's less deep? And is that variable across? You know, you've said that there's obviously a distinct difference between how things are being run in Singapore and how things are being run here. What, you know, how much differentiation do we see in why people are choosing to put the sort of support behind this?
I think, I mean, it's not a one size fits all things. I mean, as I've already said, I think some housing developers see it as adding value to what the product that they're selling. And they will invest in landscape to the degree that they think that's appropriate in that respect. At the other side, I think you see more planning authorities now trying to get more tough with developers in terms of what they have to deliver in terms of sustainable urban drainage systems. Biodiversity net gain is going to come in a big way, I think, in terms of shifting the agenda forward. And you know, that there's clearly people who are trying to sort of be leaders in terms of we want this to be a net zero project, and we want it to have 20% biodiversity net gain, and how do we do that? Those sort of clients are very few and far between at the moment, and the ones that are going for it, finding it's really quite hard to deliver that in a really fast track way. But fortunately, they will become, you know, the reference points for many others as we come forward. I think, I mean, that it's at the heart of it is for me is how do you influence all of those, because it is going to start to, you know, there's a train going to start to happen, I'm sure, in terms of we're going to biodiversity projects, we're going to create more flood management projects, we're going to create more interesting sort of local neighborhood accessibility projects. How do we best use design to sort of support those so that they do deliver across the board? It's not just a single performance tick. It's got to be much more diverse in terms of the benefits it brings. You know, to people, to nature, to the value of inclusivity. There's so many sort of facets that can be helped through the design process, I think. And that's what I find really exciting at the moment, is the opportunities for more landscape architects, basically, to do lots more interesting work.
Brilliant. Yeah, and it is really inspiring to see the work that is going on down in Bath. I know that you were a co-founder of the Forest of Imagination project, which again is about visioning, about bringing the community together to see the beautiful future. It strikes me that it effectively we're still having to build this vision, because, you know, one of the things that you'll notice, I'm going to give you an example here. If you put into Unsplash, which is the biggest, as it were, copyright free website for getting good quality images, if you put future cities in, you get lots of big glass tall skyscrapers, lots of pictures that they look like they came out of a 1950s sci-fi. They are very outdated notions of what the future city could be and of why. But there is an exception, because the Gardens by the Bay does come up. It is the only project that you could say is other than the sort of modernist ideology. It is the one thing that stands out. And it really is this, if you like, icon of what is possible. This is not just a sketch on a drawing board anymore. This is not some figment of someone's imagination. This is a project that has been fully iterated, it has been built, and it is there, and you can go and see it, you can touch it, and it shows the potential, the scale of thinking, you know, alternatively, of embedding creative ecology into the future city. You know, we are still having to build it. I mean, what are your thoughts on some of the best ways that we can actually, as it were, show the world, this is what you could have, this is what the world could look like, if only you actually bring more perspectives to the table, if only you're a little bit more experimental in how you approach cities?
Yes, that's a big question, isn't it? Sort of to unpick some of that. I mean, one of the magic things about Gardens by the Bay was that the government decided to allocate this very valuable piece of real estate in, you know, of Singapore towards open space. They'd reclaimed the land 30 years earlier, and it was just sitting there, anticipating it would just become this big building site with lots of more office blocks and things. But they decided that actually, as part of this agenda of, we want to become, you know, a city in a garden, we want projects that reinforce that, the allocated space. And I think that's one of the big challenges we have across the world, is how do we allocate space for nature and ecology in cities? And it can be at different levels, much on the ground as possible. That's good. The next thing is you need to start to create things that basically get people to react to. It can't just be a passive generic, there's lots of green. You know, that's not going to be good enough. And I think Gardens by the Bay highlighted to me that actually you do need to surprise people and create a sense of wonder. And you know, you can do that in different ways in different cities and different environments, but how do you just get people to stop and go, wow, that's beautiful, or that's enormous, or I didn't think you could get climbers to grow that high, or whatever it is. It's just having that agenda of wonder and, you know, scale in a way. Sometimes it's about scale and impact. I think the other thing is about diversity. It's to have whether it's through a park or whether it's actually through a series of streets, it's to have a diversity of really clear landscape interventions, and that may be beautiful street avenues of trees that have all sorts of wonderful diversity in them, but actually there are moments that you come to, and it might be an amazing play space, it might be a fantastic sort of vertical garden environment, it might be the most wonderful wetland, but all the best cities and the best urban environments are going to have those. They need, you want that sort of diversity. And that's what I find interesting in the discussion about 15-minute cities, for instance, is that there's none of that. There's no reference at all to contact with nature in most dialogue about this sort of compact cities, 15-minute cities. It's all about economy, accessibility, convenience for people. But the big overlay that needs to be set within it is, you know, what we're talking about now. It needs contact with nature, landscape, infrastructure, and 15-minute city needs at least 10 beautiful bits of landscape. Something like that. We need to develop those formally.
Yeah, it strikes me, you know, the 15-minute city concept, it's one of those ideas that probably does have some very site-specific applications, but it is more generally a case of a very reductionist perspective on what the city is, why it should work, how you know, in a certain way. And I think it also ignores the fact that by and large, and certainly the cities that are, if you like, the most sustainable for the future are the ones that already exist. They're the ones that much of the infrastructure is already there.
Yeah.
And, you know, it makes me think to the sort of the debate over the Marks and Spencer flagship store on Oxford Street, in that, you know, some developers came along, they said to Marks and Spencer, who'd given them a spec, well, you know, we don't think that we can adapt your building to make it fit your, you know, future needs. So we propose to knock it down and to build this 10-story alternative, which say we're going to make sustainable by carbon offsetting. And, you know, when you look at that proposal, you think it's an absolute wonder that the Mayor's office actually signed it off, not only because I think it stands to reason that anyone who has any depth of knowledge about sustainability knows that, you know, you cannot simply, embrace the argument that carbon offsetting makes a building sustainable. It's like, there was an analogy, someone said that would be like a husband having various affairs and then turning around to his wife and saying, oh, but I've offset my infidelities because I paid a certain amount. You know, it's an obscene, but also it struck me that socially, you know, that whole area of London is comparatively low rise. You know, you're not looking at buildings above about 6 stories. So that is the general character. And so to whack in this, you know, 10-story building, I just thought to myself, how on earth has it gone so wrong at Marks and Spencer, an absolute bastion of sustainability, that they have actually embraced that project? But it does strike me that has come down to box ticking, to a reductionist perspective. And actually, when we're looking at how we might rebuild our cities, you know, we really need to be incredibly creative. And you know, I think to that particular project, and I think I can literally bet you that if we went around the best architectural schools and we brought in a whole bunch of students and we said to them, right, your brief is to reimagine the Marks and Spencer head office and it's got to tick this, this and this box, they would come up with ideas that were not just imaginative, but that could actually address the brief. And that would probably actually be more economic, because they're not coming to the table with the same prejudices. They are coming with a completely open mindset, and also not just about, you know, what the building needs to be, but also about the business model, about what it means to be a retailer. And you know, I do think there are so many missed opportunities at the moment. But you know, it does feel that we are making progress, because if nothing else, you know, we're seeing a number of notable projects come into physical being. And then, of course, you're in the situation that you can prove the credibility through getting back that data as to their performance and, you know, their influence. And, you know, it struck me as well. I mean, I was just thinking then, I know back in the around about sort of 10 years ago, the Salford City Council were actually quite proactive in terms of thinking about, they had various disused areas, and they were working with the University of Salford, with the School of Built Environment, with a view to creating test projects where they could actually show how you could address critical environmental and social problems. And so they actually gave up a whole street, if I remember correctly, a whole street to the university, and said, right, School of Built Environment, off you go, guys. And, you know, they have had people like Eric Bichard, Professor Eric Bichard, has been really very proactive in terms of thinking about how, you know, that city could be reimagined. I'm not sure the pace right now, but I know certainly a decade ago there was huge momentum, and it wasn't just a case of one project going on, it was a number. And so, you know, when you were speaking about Singapore and about the fact that the government had the vision to give the Gardens by the Bay site and say, this is fundamental to our future city. We want to build what will be a world-leading, a beautiful project. But actually, it strikes me that project at the level of the city is incredibly enriching, and not least when people have been confined to Singapore for 2 years in the pandemic. What is the on-the-ground feedback that you have had in terms of how the citizenry of Singapore have experienced the project that you and your team built?
Well, I mean, there's lots of feedback. I mean, the astonishing things are numbers sometimes. And, you know, when we were first planning it and designing it, the guidance was we might get 3 million visitors a year, and the business, you know, the operation system works around that. But we anticipated we needed to think a little bit further ahead. Before the pandemic, it was getting 12 million visitors a year. You know, it's had nearly 70 million visitors, I think, since it opened. It's astonishing numbers of people experienced it. And partially, I mean, in terms of the locals, I mean, yeah, they're very clever. They don't go out during the day where it's really hot. They'll find the right times of the day to go and have a walk around, and it's usually in the evening. And that's when you see thousands and thousands of local Singaporeans just having a really nice time and actually gathering under the super trees, which, you know, it's a daily festival in a way, just seeing how that works. And I think the other aspect to it is just the opportunity to see nature, you know, whether it's dragonflies or butterflies or the bird life that's now evolved, and more famously it's the otters. There's a sort of I think it's the biggest family of smooth otters in Singapore now. They've colonized the water bodies, and, you know, they've become a tourist attraction in their own right. So yeah, I mean, we get lots of really, really good sort of feedback, and then the locals tend, you know, they tend not to go inside the biomes that much, although, you know, that's one of the big ideas, is that create a nice cool environment for people to visit. But they're very much attractive to the visitor, who's not used to the humidity and the heat. They'll get into the cool biomes. Yeah, so it you know, it's worked on so many levels, I think, as a project, and many of them not anticipated when we first started it. But that's the beauty. I mean, I suppose the magic of the project was the brief set by National Parks Board, and Dr. Tan, who is the chairman, who's an amazing character, who basically made the whole thing, just pushed it all the way through. But just saying that the client are the plants, create a world for the plants, and the people will follow. It's a bit like David Attenborough saying, build it and nature will come. It's, you know, that's been the sort of system. You know, you create a fantastic green, diverse environment, and the people will love it. And I think that's the story there.
So, you know, city mayors around the world, governments around the world really should be looking to that project then and seeing that, you know, you haven't just you haven't just met the spec, it's gone way beyond that, in that it's outperformed the original brief. And as you say, it's a magnet. I mean, I would qualify it's become a global tourist attraction. It is, in terms of its sort of visibility. It's like the current day Gizas of pyramids of Giza. You know, it is the gardens of Babylon. I mean, this is something that is incredibly famous, and that it, you know, has within what's quite a short amount of time become one of the foremost emblems, if you like, of Singapore. You know, and it just strikes me there's so much potential to do that. And sometimes I look, I mean, one of the projects that I am particularly critical of, going back to, you know, your 15-minute city, is the sort of the line project. You know, the idea that the city should be in a straight line, and there's this sort of transportation link, this little train that you go up and down to get from one end of the city to the other. I mean, that literally strikes me as being something out of a bad 70s sci-fi. It totally reflects. Yeah. I mean, I really am hoping, I'm sorry to the guys behind it, but I really am hoping it doesn't go ahead, because it just strikes me that absolutely nothing from city theory, nothing from what we know of how cities function has been taken into account. It really is a recipe for disaster. And I think what a shame, because when you think of that territory, when you think of the Middle East, this is a place that historically the peoples of that place, they adapted to live in some of the very harshest conditions on the planet. They evolved incredibly sophisticated ways of coexisting within that harsh environment. The ecologies of that place are actually, again, they're quite migratory. You know, it's a place in flux. And so if you were to think about that as a possible locale to build a future city, there are so many extraordinary and rich and meaningful things that you could do there. And so I think it is really very sad that is the big project. They haven't just created it, they've been marketing this thing worldwide. They've been trying to get people to go there. And what a missed opportunity, because, you know, looking at it, if it is built, it's just going to become some sort of ghetto, because it's not going to function in the way that a city needs to. So, you know, it's something I hope that, you know, will happen, is that Gardens by the Bay will catalyse the global city community to understand just what the potential is here. So I wanted to ask you, thinking to nature-inspired approaches and placemaking with cities, and what's going on now? What the sort of the projects, that be they student projects, be they practice projects, wherever they are, what's really capturing your imagination? What do you think is stand out?
I think there's some, well, I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, the big responses to the big challenges of climate are obviously going to be a fascination. I really like the work Kate Orff is doing in the States with a studio Scape, which is looking at, you know, one of our sort of studies is the whole of the Mississippi Basin, which is basically half of America as far as I can see. and understanding how that sort of cascades down and the implications on how it outfalls into the sea and the flooding aspects of that. And just thinking big scale, what do we need to do to bring this back into some sort of balance and order? And I think her work on coastal areas, particularly in New York, using oyster beds and those sort of things, I mean, these are, you know, inspirational projects, and I just applaud what she's doing and pioneering. And similarly, the student work out of the Philadelphia University, McHarg Institute, those sort of places, which are once again looking critically, I guess, at this is what should we be doing, sort of strategically, globally. So I love all of that. In terms of the UK, I do really have great expectations for the biodiversity net gain narrative as that starts to take hold. Clearly, there are some projects already that are starting to think, okay, well, I can't actually deliver that on my site, so how do I deliver that? What's the process I need to do? Where's the site that I can contribute to sort of make that sort of work in terms of biodiversity stories? And you know, the Wildlife Trust and local authorities who are building the nature recovery network across the UK, I think you know, often independent, and instead of the government, once again, you know, this is stuff that people are recognizing we need to do, and it should be funded properly and all those sort of things. But these are, they're big strategic moves, I think, really good. At the opposite scale, I mean, I think I love seeing James Wong and his work that he does, is creating these beautiful little mini gardens in his house. You know, it's like how do you bring biophilic sort of environment to your tiniest home in the most beautiful way? And you know, I think that's obviously an emerging trend as well. But you know, I think it has to be, you know, for us, I mean, we're always thinking these different scales. big strategic planning thinking, how do we do that? Then also, you know, how do you bring a moment to somebody's daily life that they can enjoy and take away with that? There's many others, I'm sure, but does that give a flavour?
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things one of the earlier conversations we had was with Alice and Gavin Munro of Full Grown. And when I asked Alice about her vision for the future, one of the things she said is that she would very much like to see what are effectively spaces that are unproductive of present, things like sort of the verges of motorways and other places that haven't really had much thought put into them, turned over in effect to nature, but curated nature, where what you do is you bring in the local community and you think about how you can create environments that are both ecologically enriching, but also actually help solve the critical problems that we humans are facing, things like food scarcity, and actually, you know, one of the things they have is their furniture orchard. So, you know, she was actually visioning furniture orchards, but configured in slightly different ways, and so that communities could get involved. And I really love that idea, because it struck me of sort of going back almost to, well, in time, but also thinking to places like Croatia, where, you know, the garden is not just a place of beauty, it's a productive place. It is somewhere that people grow fruit and veg and so forth to meet their needs. And actually, in almost the William Morris vision, you know, the idea that we all have to be engaged and we all have to be involved. And you know, it strikes me that, you know, with your work, you know, it opens up those opportunities so that we you know, we don't just sort of bring ideas to the table that if you like tick agendas, and that even just, you know, as well as that beautify areas, but that actually engage the community in meaningful ways and ways that actually offer them value. That, you know, that strikes me as a really strong vision.
Yeah. No, I need to tell you about the Tower of London in that context. I don't know if you've recognised or seen that. Basically, we're involved with this big Jubilee event during the summer, the Super Bloom. So that is effectively turning the moat around the Tower of London into a mass of flowers for the summer.
Wow.
But the important thing is that actually that's just the start of reshaping, rethinking the moat as effectively a nature reserve, you know, full of pollinator-friendly species, allowing the locals to access it in a more engaging way. So it is, I think it's going to be one of those examples of a transformational use of space. That it's gone from just amenity grassland to something that's got different levels of value. And we're exploring, you know, just starting to think about what that legacy garden environment's going to be, whether it has the productive gardens, community gardens. It's definitely going to be, you know, very much a biodiversity focused environment, but the opportunity for people to engage with that and go into it and enjoy it. And we need more projects like that, because certainly amenity grassland, yes, it's got great value for certain uses, but there's so much of it that just serves no purpose anymore. And, you know, things like golf courses, for instance, as well. It's interesting here in Bath, there are two golf courses that have been run by the council that have basically been losing money for several years because people are not using them enough. And so one of them has been returned to a different use, of which a lot of it will be sort of a biodiverse environment.
That's wonderful. And, you know, I was thinking about the Tower of London. The wonderful thing about that is that it's already a major tourist attraction. So if you bring in an exemplary project that really shows off how you can make what, you know, green urban spaces already exist, ecologically productive, then that in effect, you know, is the perfect place to show off those ideas, because they already have that footfall, they have that traffic. And then obviously if, like the Gardens by the Bay, that project then in turn adds to their interest and, you know, makes yet more people come in a little bit like, you know, the V&A. The V&A has an amazing permanent collection, but the matter that it's regularly hosting exhibitions brings in the extra punters. You know, that strikes me as a very workable model, both in terms of the ecology, human need, and economically. So, you know, that's a really wonderful project. Just thinking, you know, you started off, you were saying your career in Qatar. Thinking about the more difficult regions of the world in terms of the places, you know, plants, as it were, have harsher conditions to live in. How do you imagine creative ecologies working in those environments in the years and decades ahead?
Well, I mean, in a lot of places, it is actually starting from scratch and doing research in terms of how do you restore certain environments. We've been linked to a project in Madagascar where it's basically the Bristol Zoo have a sort of a project which is about conserving the blue-eyed black lemurs, which live in a particular part of Madagascar, the northwest side of it, which is essentially, it's supposed to be woodland, but it's sort of so dry for so much of the year that actually it's very hard to sort of get plants re-established easily. So they've been working with the local communities, just doing loads of sort of research, basically. How do we restore natural woodland, but actually also at the same time, how do we help sustain the local communities by creating more economic crops like cocoa and things like this. So I mean, I think that's the sad thing is that we're back for a lot of these places. We're at square one because the environments are so denuded, and the conditions for actually creating, you know, what we all want is there's no easy solution. So it needs some real innovation in lots of different ways. And once again, you know, it's in a way it's a different set of people who, you know, it's the sort of horticultural scientist level of knowledge. It's very specific. Often each of these environments just needs somebody who knows how they work. What is the precise sort of tolerance of the grains of sand or whatever it is, the soil composition, and how do you manage the water processes in those areas?
Yeah, so again, assembling those teams of expertise such that you have that knowledge of place to mitigate really tough challenges. I'm thinking, if you have any questions, just send them rolling in. The other thing I was thinking about is, you know, one of the themes that, you know, we've been talking about a lot in this series is how we effectively educate and enable people to really make these changes. So, you know, we all know that sometimes political changes can take a long time, particularly in you know, places where the politics are very complex, like America. You know, what are some of the ways that you see, you know, your ordinary sort of man and woman on the street being able to really push this agenda forward and bring about change in their local communities?
Yeah, I mean I mean every community is going to be different, and certainly if you're in the middle of a very dense city and you want to create more green space, that's a different challenge to being in the middle of the Lake District. And how do we create more biodiversity on the barren hills? You know, sort of really interesting, different challenges that we all face. I think, I mean, what's interesting is that, you know, often from my experience, the sort of community engaging projects are started by somebody in the community who's interested and enthusiastic about that particular topic. I could just use Bath examples, I guess, to a certain extent. We just started supporting a project to create some tree trails in Bath, and it's not just here's a bunch of old trees and this is how old they are and their scientific significance. It's about why are they interesting, what's their role in the city, how do they appeal to children, what's the stories you can get from what's the sort of sensory tactile sort of environment that they create for people as you move past them. And that was just started by a lovely lady who said, I want to sort of create a tree trail. And I've seen it in other cities, what do we do? So that started a chain of events. There's loads of people involved. It's going to be wonderful. The same thing, you mentioned Forests of Imagination earlier. I think that came from the same place, is that, you know, Bath is an amazing place. It's got lots of creative people. There's lots of interesting relationships between creatives. But how do we actually show that to people? And at the same time, how do we use that creativity to talk about environmental issues, not just here in Bath, but also globally? And that's how Forest has evolved in a way. It's just that mechanism to engage with, well, we've got 27 schools that regularly take part, both universities and the college, about 50 local organisations, not all creative organisations. So it's this wonderful little bubble of people who share some values and making a difference, really. And so that's one way. There's lots of other ways. I'm sure I can't think of any at the moment.
You know, when you were talking about the trail, I mean, it struck me that storytelling is a really important part of placemaking, and particularly when it comes to enabling people to really understand how their environment works, its history. You know, and I'm thinking to Dr. Matthew Green, the historian for London. He has tours. Well, he does them in various places, but one of his sort of regular concerns is a tour around London, in which, although he talks about, you know, the brothels and the drinking dens and, and all the untoward things, he also talks, among other things, about how nature was effectively perceived and integrated into the city of past. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, for example, he spoke to the fact that they would bring in sheep from the rural areas only because they felt that the people, you know, of the finer parts of London would be offended by their smell. And, you know, the sort of their general disheveledness. They would sort of groom the sheep, they would buff them up like they used to with their wigs, you know, they'd powder and they'd be perfumed, and they would be put in this sort of Fragonard style garden, idyllic little setting, and that, so say, was what, you know, the farm was and what nature was, and so on. So a very sort of contrived scenario, but then that really helps you to understand, you know, how some of the peoples of that era perceived of nature. And it struck me, you know, that with trees, because they have obviously, some of them, an ancient oak will have been around, what, a millennia, maybe even more. And, you know, the stories that tells, the stories ecologically. Another thing that we talked about with full grain was the fact that trees, through their rings, they obviously tell you very interesting and important information ecologically. They tell you about what the sort of precipitation levels, the droughts were. Something I learned from that conversation was they even tell you about the wind patterns. So you can tell a huge amount about your environment from a tree. But then obviously you have things like the sort of the cultural aspect, you have things like the folk tales, you have things like the stories that are attached to the tree. So it does strike me as a really important way and a really accessible way of enabling people to have quite sophisticated understanding of their environment, and also to make their new stories, their new narratives, and informed by, if you like, some of the sort of the mistakes of the past, i.e. the powdering the sheep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I think trees in cities, I mean, they are absolutely fundamentally important. And it's interesting how we can use, you know, modern technologies and smart technologies to demonstrate the value of trees. I mean, the project doing in Europe is basically using remote sensing and all sorts of things. You can start to understand the value of trees in terms of temperature, humidity, air quality. There's all of these things that you can measure remotely and sort of just build up, you know, not just the evidence to say, look, we need more trees, but basically it's a management tool for how we should manage cities. It's how do we locate things in the right places, the density of trees, the species of trees, to give us that resilience for the future. And so yeah, I mean, they're the heart of life for me. The sort of the sort of, you know, the trees that you know, we all have our favourite somewhere.
What's your favourite tree?
I suppose it changes. We have in our garden, we have one which is a hop tree. It's something I'd never really seen in the UK before. I wondered what on earth it was, but it's got this wonderful twisted branch form, and it comes into leaf late. But when it does, it's just this perfect thing that I see every day. But yeah, I mean, I've got lots of other favourite trees. I mean, Bath's got some beautiful trees, whether, you know, the big plane trees in the circus or big beech trees on the top of the hills. You know, they're great reference points. And to get people to get to know them, and as you say, understand some of these stories, I think we should all be trying to do that a bit more.
It strikes me that, you know, trees have been quite unloved, because when you think back, I mean, for all the faults of some of our ancestors, one of the things that they, you know, did do back in the sort of 17, 18, 1900s was they collected the seed collections, they brought in plants. It was actually considered to be a high status thing to have a biodiverse collection and to be ecologically knowledgeable. And although we see that, I mean, I saw a very sad documentary last night. It was on Michael Jackson's Neverland, and it was on how the project was run, and it was on what happened to the animals afterwards. And one of the reasons I watched it is because it was, you know, talking about the fact that the private zoo industry is now worth, I think it was, they said 300 billion or something ridiculous in America alone. It is an obscenely huge industry where, you know, the animals are typically treated diabolically, and the reason that many people are buying them is because they think of them as prestige. They think of it as high status to own a tiger. But you know, it strikes me that, you know, many sort of species from around the world are fascinating, they are beautiful, and it would be really good to see a real pride in the species that you have in cities generally, and whereby, you know, creating that sort of ecological diversity. And not, sometimes when you look at city plans, when you look at greening the city, they're very generic. It's nobody bothers to necessarily talk about, you know, the reason that you have chosen a very specific species to go in a very specific place, certainly at the level of sort of architectural planning. And it strikes me that's such, again, a missed opportunity. There are so many creative things that could be done here. There could be, as you say, the tours, there could be festivals, there could be all sorts of things going on here in terms of productivity, in terms of how those trees function in the city, how people relate to them. So, you know, I really hope that we start to see that open up. And, you know, it's really inspiring, the work that you're doing with the Forest of the Imagination, to help people on that journey, to really give them the tools they need to make those visions.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it comes back to that word wonder, I guess, and, you know, sort of triggering imagination and thinking about things that they don't normally think about, people don't normally think about. And you can bring wonder to a tree by putting a soundscape within it and getting it to talk to you. And there's all sorts of things that you can do at different scales, and you know, it's great fun experimenting with those, definitely.
Yeah, actually, you make me think also to we had Rachel Horton Kitchlew joined us and for another series, and she's actually a harpist, and we were having a chat about the fact that now that, yes, there's sound ecologies, and the fact that ecologists are listening to trees, they have worked out they have heartbeats and so on and so forth, and the idea of integrating that into orchestral arrangements and, you know, making music from it. And again, you know, that could be wonderful, couldn't it? Doing that live, doing that pre-recorded, mixing it into soundtracks.
It's inspirational. I mean, one of our Forest Imagination events we had around the Abbey in Bath, and Martin Ware, who sort of Heaven 17, he's a regular sort of supporter of us, and he created this wonderful soundscape which we had in the Abbey, which was, you know, the sounds of Madagascar, the lemurs and things, but also overlaid with a beautiful sort of classical score in a way that is done by his son Gabriel. And it's suddenly you're in a film.
Yeah.
It's not just here's Bath Abbey again, and it's got the nice light coming through. It's you're transported, and this is what I find, this sort of combination of, yes, we need to sort of get the ecological systems and the science and the magic, the process is really right, but it's got to also have magic and be inspirational, and you've got to be able to feel it somehow as a human. You've got to sort of engage with that, and it's got to give you something back. And I think that's what, that's the work that we try to do.
And it's right, it strikes me here, this our sort of conversation is really emphasizing the role of artists in this, of actually helping people to see what can seem to be ordinary things around them in entirely new ways, in magical ways, in ways that elicit wonder and that actually inspire them. Like the tree in your garden, you look at that, it's this incredible thing. It's evolved over millennia. It's sort of this crescendo of evolution, and that is what the artist does, isn't it? They bring that light to these wondrous things that have been overlooked, and can be imagined in new and marvelous ways.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. Well, I've got 2 questions for you that everyone in this series is being asked, because they're going to be compiled. So your first question is, the year is 2050. What does the biomaterialized, or you could say the creative ecologies world look and feel like? How are the cities of the world going to be in 2050 in your mind?
It's a very interesting question, because it means that really it's going to have a maturity that's born out of whatever we do in the next 10 years. So I'm slightly tempering my huge imagination in terms of the what it could be to what we think is going to happen over the next 10 years, I guess. And I think basically all cities are going to be greener. I think it's everybody's around the world. There's a sense of, we want to make cities greener, and we'll do that on buildings, on podiums, in the streets, in people's gardens, in people's homes, and so that's a sort of surface level, I guess. They'll look a bit different. What I'm hoping is that basically the infrastructure that sustains that is also upgraded. In the UK, the whole drainage system, the way we manage water, and across the world, how we manage water is going to be a fundamental part of the future of cities. So hopefully we've got back to a point where we're almost thinking sort of ancient technologies and ancient processes to capture the water, use the water efficiently, store it as we can, and that will have a changing influence on the physical environment of cities as well. What plants grow in soils, conservation of soils is a fundamental thing, but actually to sustain all this new green, we'll need new soils. And how do we create those? Where do they come from? What are we making them from? Waste products from various quarrying processes, green composting, mixing with that. I mean, there's a whole industry there to evolve that will come with that. And similarly, where are the plants going to come from? There's a sort of got to be a shift in the way we think about the horticultural industry as principally not just something that gives you some nice plants for your garden, but it's actually it's an industry that's a life support system. It's the equivalent of agriculture and food production. It's about creating green, growing, vegetated environments that offer different values. It's about producing oxygen, absorbing carbon dioxide, creating filtration. So you start to think about things in a very different way, I hope. And the idea that actually, we consciously plan all of our green space in cities to share with biodiversity the appropriate nature. You know, I think the idea of, you know, sort of 50% of the planet for biodiversity is a wonderful idea. E.O. Wilson's sort of narrative, and I think that should apply to every project almost. It's like every city should be 50% nature, landscape experience, 50% built environment. So there's a few thoughts for me. I mean, exactly what it all looks like. Hopefully there'll be less concrete, less steel, less glass, more humane scale, more beauty, more wonder.
That sounds a beautiful vision. I'm liking that a lot. And your final question from me, audience, again, if you have any questions, get them in. You have one wish. If a genie popped out of a magical lamp and granted you just one wish for building our biofutures, what would it be?
Well, I think it's a slightly glib answer, I guess, but basically to use all of the current money that's spent on subsidizing fossil fuels, on regenerating natural environments. So I was just looking at, because of the question, I was just made me think. So apparently, this is the IMF, they did a study last year. They said $11 million a minute is spent on oil and gas subsidies in the world. Just imagine, that's almost $6 trillion a year that is just being, you know, it doesn't cost that much to produce the oil and gas. It's just trying to suppress the cost to the customer through that. How ridiculous is that? And what we could do with that money in all sorts of different ways. Even in the UK, apparently it's about $10 billion, £10 billion a year that is just through tax breaks and other sort of funding of research and particular projects that goes to oil and gas that should be going to renewables. It could be going to creating the, you know, the greener, more biodiverse, more ecological world that we're all talking about.
Yeah.
And, you know, that would be wonderful.
That sounds great. And, you know, and I think people are starting to realise that there is an alternative. A project actually that, again, University of Salford did, I think this was now decades ago. They built a house that was so well insulated, it didn't need any heating at all throughout the entire year. Another chap, Mike Hillard, you might know of his, he built a property near Stroud. It was a house, it was effectively a passive house, but built quite recently, I think just about 15 years ago. Again, because of the configuration of the architecture and the insulation materials and so forth, it needed no heating. Not only did it need no heating, it had a huge conservatory on the back where he could grow bananas. He was, I think there was a piece in the news about the fact that he became something like the first person to successfully grow bananas in the UK because he was growing them in his passively heated conservatory. So, you know, the idea that we actually need to be reliant on fossil fuels for our homes is obviously, that actually comes down to bad design, because we can design properties and we can retrofit properties in a way that eradicates that. We know that with vehicle design, if we look to the Aptera vehicle off in California in development now, what that would be more than a decade, more than a dozen years indeed, you know, through its aerodynamics, it is, and through the fact it's got 3 wheels, not 4 on the road, so reduces the friction. It had already extended the range that it could do on one single electric charge to 1,000 kilometers. However, their latest design innovation was actually integrating solar panels into the car's materiality. And so they now have a vehicle, they now have a model that you literally don't have to fuel because the sun charges the car. I mean, you know, we do have design solutions, don't we? So we don't actually need to be reliant on fossil fuels. Obviously, this is coming into the issues of politics, but I think if the crisis that we are witnessing now, the absolute devastation that is going on at Europe's borders, which obviously fossil fuels are a big, big part of that. Obviously, Russia's selling its fossil fuels to the world. If that isn't our massive wake-up call, and if that just doesn't catalyse the real level shift in terms of where we put our money, and how we look upon how we build the future. We've talked in this session today about many incredible possibilities for our future cities throughout the series we have, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many extraordinary people working on really intelligent, creative and magical ideas that we can do a bit better than we've seen of late around the world. So thank you for joining me and our audience today. It's been an absolute pleasure, Andrew. I will really look forward to seeing your upcoming projects. I'll share your link, obviously, in this. As you know, there will be a compilation of the ideas from this series, and I will come back to you so that we can maybe put in a few of the other things you're working on to enrich that. But yeah, thank you for being here, Andrew.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity, Melissa. It's been a great conversation. So yeah, fascinating.
Brilliant. Well, you take care. And just for those that are interested, next week's session is with Professor Rachel Armstrong. She will be joining us to talk about living architectures, living materials, and all the wonderful work that she's working on in her new academic role. She's joined just this past 6 months or so. So thank you for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.